Everyone, my name is Rafał Cymerys. I work at Upside, which is a software consultancy slash software house, whatever you name it. And last year, we took over an open source framework called Spree as a lead maintainer. So I'm going to share some interesting stories about maintaining that, helping people scale, and helping our users be happy users. So I stole the first part actually from Rails website because they claim that Rails applications can scale from MVP to IPO with no problem. And I put that into a context of building an open source framework that then other companies use to scale from MVP to an actual IPO. So a few words about Spree. So Spree is an e-commerce framework, which is interesting because it's not only a developer tool, but also it contains a huge bunch of business logic specific to a particular domain. It is built on top of Rails, state-of-the-art, Rails way of things for quite a lot of years. And it's been out there since 2008, so we're celebrating our 15th anniversary. We actually took Spree over as the third maintainer in the line after two previous companies that were in charge of that. And I don't have a QR code. I didn't know that it was a trend these days. But I think our GitHub handle is fairly easy to type on your own. So check it out if you haven't met it before. So maybe a bit of a story of how Spree started. So as you can imagine, as any open source tool starts, it starts with a commit. In this case, that was actually an empty dummy commit. 3 commits later that day, we actually got something meaningful, which was the base of the Rails app. I think at that time that was Rails 2 or something like that. It's also quite interesting because if I saw that correctly, that commit actually predates GitHub because GitHub was launched in I don't know, April that same year, at least publicly. So quite a bunch of history. So those were the humble beginnings, right? Somebody is doing their proof of concept, trying to implement an open source framework for e-commerce in the new cool trendy framework called Rails. How it's going? Well, we have GitHub these days. We've had multiple releases ever since. As I said, we have the third maintainer. We have plenty of contributors. Maybe it's not the highest amount you can see out there, but still pretty measurable. It is used by plenty of users, and we've had over almost 200 releases just in the core repository. There's a huge ecosystem of other extensions that build on top of Spree, right next to it. What else? Well, it powers many successful businesses of all sizes. So if you look at the landscape, there are some mom and pop shops that hired some developer just to launch a simple web shop because they didn't want to use Shopify for whatever reason. You have some startups that use Spree to grow their businesses. And you also have those multi-million, multi-hundred million dollar businesses of those huge enterprises that use Spree somewhere in their stack. Sometimes you don't even see that. It's under the hood, used as, for example, order management system or as a system for inventory. So you get all sorts of combinations like that. What else? Well, we also noticed that over the years, one of the Spree-powered businesses that were using those disruptive business models, right? So for example, when there was this trend of subscriptions, I think it started with Dollar Shave Club, right? This company that did those $1 shaving machines that they then sold to some big corporation. That was, for example, the time when there was a huge growth of Spree-based applications because it was easy to customize to build on top of it. And we, of course, owe a lot of that to Rails. But if you go around, and we did a lot of that over the last year, and before that we were also an avid Spree user, helping many clients implement that or maintain that, this doesn't come without challenges, right? And I think that pretty much every open source project that gets a certain adoption faces similar set of challenges, although it is also the proportion of those challenges differ depending on what that tooling does. But we found like three major areas that tend to be challenging. One is the general like roadmap, vision, and giving users the certainty that this is going to be maintained and that it's actually what they want to stick to. The other thing is upgrades, the obvious like maintenance problem. And the third one is maintainability of like custom code built on top of the framework, which is also a pretty big area, and I will cover that in more details later. And those three major challenges also have a specific impact on the users, but also on the like businesses using, on the developers, and then the businesses that use a specific framework. Of course, if you don't have a proper roadmap, or if you don't get the trust of people that the tooling is going in the direction that makes sense, you suddenly become a business risk, not only for developers, but sometimes also for the higher-ups who make business decisions, because, well, nobody wants to stick to abandonware, right? Or to tools that are obsolete or just don't make sense, given that there are newer technologies. With upgrades, obviously, one day the team that uses that tool will get an email from their like chief information security officer saying that there's like this big red flag because, well, you haven't upgraded your Spree-based application or like a Rails-based application, and we can go through a like security audit or whatever. So that becomes an issue. And the third thing is maintainability, and that's where I think both Rails but also Spree struggles in multiple ways. I think as somebody said during the previous discussion, like Rails boosts your productivity a lot because it gives you those powerful tools, like meta programming, all sorts of stuff that Java people don't have out of the box. But at the same time, if you go too far, that is a problem, right? And what's interesting is that sometimes you get to take over a code base that's, for example, using an old version of Spree that wasn't very well maintained, where the decisions made in the framework actually have like directed developers to also make further bad decisions, which is quite interesting, and this is something that we get to fight with a lot. And then, of course, what happens if those things escalate too much, right? If we're building open source, we want everybody to use our open source because it's just great. We're proud of it, right? And we want everybody to be happy. But sometimes, if any of those three issues gets too far, and we've also seen some of those issues escalate too much in the past, even with Spree, various things happen, right? At first, like new users will be tempted to use other solutions because they will hear from existing users that maybe it's not that great of a choice. But sometimes, if you're not, if you make your existing users angry enough, they will start considering other options. And this is also, I think that's a huge red flag, because like nobody replatforms things for fun, right? And there are many companies that just like nearly went out of business because they were doing unnecessary rewrites, etc. So if you hear that somebody changes like the core of their stack, that means that the issue may be actually quite serious. It's not something we do for fun. And sometimes, as happened to Spree, which I think is quite interesting, sometimes the community will just do what open source can do. So they will fork your framework, and they will start developing like a concurrent version of it. So at some point when Spree wasn't that actively maintained and it lacked this like vision, roadmap, etc., some people from the community just created a fork of it. And that's how we have Solidus these days, which is like a parallel version of a similar framework. They even use the same modules inside the code base, which is quite interesting. And from what we've seen, that causes multiple smaller issues, right? It's a bit confusing for newcomers. Like they have two options that are quite similar, but not the same. So there's this like, internal war of which option is better, which is quite a waste of resources and time. And then, of course, you have like two communities maintaining like using the same effort to pretty much build a similar thing. But this can also happen. It's at the same time beauty of open source, but it can also be annoying in some situations. So I wanted to dive deeper into those challenges and just show you in detail what are the detailed problems that they create, but also what are the steps that we've been historically and like we're working on those right now, just to make those three major challenges a bit more smoother, just to keep existing users, to keep getting new users, and make sure that everybody is happy and that they can focus on their happy development work. So first thing, and that's been a bit of a problem for us, was the roadmap. It sounds like, some open source projects have a roadmap, some don't, and they get away with it. But what we've seen is that, like, initially when you're doing those first commits to open source, you're just like, building your side project, trying to experiment with some ideas. It doesn't really matter, right? You'll be cranking up new features quite rapidly. You may get a better sense of what you need and what the community needs. But once you hit a certain adoption, that actually becomes very important for all the users. Not only to show them that there's a particular vision of the project, but also to make it easier for them to work with it. And we've seen that if there's like no clear future of the project, people start wondering, like, is this going to be maintained? Or maybe is it maintained even now, right? So that raises questions that slowly become an issue with the community. There's a cool feature with GitHub. They did a lot of good work around those like small tools for communities where you can have discussions, but you can also very easily build like projects out of GitHub issues. And that's like the low-hanging fruit, just to show, what are the next milestones, what are the features that we want to build. And that's what we've adapted some time ago. So far, it's been just useful for having transparency with everybody, to show them that there's a plan, and also to give them an impression of what they can expect of the framework in the upcoming future. And what's also interesting with roadmaps, because on one hand, we can give people an assurance that a certain framework is going to be maintained. The other thing is that it's also easier for people to contribute, because if they see that, hey, there's this useful feature that's already like scheduled, from what we've seen is that once we published the roadmap, people started actually getting engaged in specific items on the roadmap, just like trying to collectively think how to architect a certain solution, or what are the improvements that can be made. Otherwise, it's easy to get into this chaos where people obviously want to contribute, but, well, they try to contribute all over the place, and it's not necessarily aligned with what needs to be, what we as the maintainer, see longer term. So that was one thing regarding the roadmap, which is more a communication issue, but still very important in my opinion. The second thing is upgrades. And that's like, if you talk to people, they usually want to be on the newer version of things, right? Nobody wants to stick to like Rails 3 because, all their friends use the shiny new thing whenever possible. Unless it's, of course, like Windows Vista, where, you hear that somebody, like the developer broke a lot of things. So, but that's like an exception, right? But at the same time, from the like business perspective, it's not always a value added, right? Especially if it's like maintenance kind of work, upgrading some dependencies, etc. So that is sometimes just hard to budget or to sell to your bosses, especially if upgrading is very complex. And if there are like multiple breaking changes during upgrades, people just start delaying that, and you end up in a situation where you do a brand new release where you've brought a lot of cool things that everybody needs, but then you see the actual installations of your users, and they still stick to like 1-year-old or 2-year-old versions, just because, well, they don't have time and resources to perform the upgrade. And this actually comes from the JavaScript community, which in my mind, it was always way more excited about adopting new things, right? Where people shifted frameworks every year. But it seems like even there's people are starting to think like, do we need to keep rewriting things all the time? And they are just getting tired of it because it blocks new development. And well, there's not that much value in rewriting the whole thing. So that's the kind of voice that I see a lot on Twitter these days from all sorts of communities. But there's also there are problems in upgrading, right? There are breaking changes in our frameworks code, which for Spree is mostly business logic, certain core e-commerce processes, and that is fortunately something that we control, and we can we can postpone some changes or spread them out throughout the time. There's unfortunately changes in Rails where I think later versions were pretty good to be upgraded, but sometimes you stumble upon like some changes in default association options and things that can effectively break a lot of things for people, or like getting rid of TypeScript support in Turbo and this kind of stuff. And that's something that by maintaining a Rails-based framework, we rely on, but we don't really have control over that, right? So we took this approach that preferably, whenever possible, we should just avoid making any like major breaking changes. Also, given that people have quite dated installations that are hard enough for them to upgrade, just to give them more room to upgrade Rails and all sorts of other core frameworks, but to give them a fairly stable interface of Spree that they can rely on. Of course, we're not Microsoft, and we cannot support certain design decisions made, I don't know, that's like 50 years ago now. It turns out like Windows 10 still have some of those design decisions that were influenced by some very old, I think it's pre-DOS kind of things. But still, well, we've learned that being more conservative, especially with like older, more established frameworks, is generally better because people don't complain about it that much. And sometimes, we see that there's this like ugly piece of code that maybe it would make sense to refactor. It's not always the best idea just because you can break a lot of things for people who somehow rely on that. Sometimes you even get some contributions from the community where somebody says, yeah, currently you can assign like dimensions to a product, but we know that, sometimes those dimensions can be assigned to a particular variant of a product. So if like you have, I don't know, boxes of shoes, and then you have shoes in various sizes, right? Then they can have various sizes of boxes, some like edge cases. So technically that makes sense. But then you evaluate that from the perspective of existing users, and you can break a lot of things by just making the right decisions conceptually. So we're trying to avoid those as much as possible. Of course, it's not always possible, and sometimes you need to get rid of some like legacy behaviors or reliance on some older libraries. But in that case, from our experience, it's good to have like this depreciation schedule where you explicitly mention, you add some even log warnings that something will be gotten rid of at some point. So please start thinking about migrating that to the new behavior. We had this kind of thing with APIs. So Spree, I think pretty much ever since the beginning, had some APIs for performing administrative actions, where you could access the overall order history, users, etc. But that was an API that was fairly poorly written, especially by today's standards. So it relied on some old gems for serializing JSONs to JSONs. It wasn't very flexible and was quite heavy. So for a couple of years, we had a situation where we had two APIs in parallel. The trying to direct developers to always stick to the new one unless absolutely necessary. Last year, we extracted the old API to a separate gem that if you really need it, you can still pull that back into your project. But like we're not pushing that on people, and we don't want people to keep using that. What's funny is that this old API interface is used by, for example, Klaviyo, which is a very popular email marketing tool. So they have an integration inside their product where you can connect it to a Spree-based store. And this is something that we know a lot of people need just because some external tools learned to rely on that. So this needs to be taken into account. Yeah, so in general, once the project matures, our experience is that you just need to go a bit slower, and that's okay because, well, it serves its purpose. And at the same time, just think about, like making depreciations in a proper way rather than rewriting the whole thing between two even major versions. That's not always a good idea, but probably never a good idea. And finally, the interesting topic in the general context of Rails and Railsway. As I said, Spree started in 2008, and it used a lot of like those Railsway things, right? It used hooks for like after create, before update, and all sorts of things you can still find across the code base. Unfortunately, for a long time, it also relied on this like fat model, thin controller kind of approach, right? And that brought certain challenges. And another thing is that like Rails and Ruby, they come with this promise that they are flexible, right? You have a, I don't know, third-party library, you don't like it because something works slightly differently that you would like, you can still monkey patch everything, right? That's like the ultimate measure that, for a fun fact, was for quite a while the preferred method of customizing Spree. So you can think of that as just taking a Rails app, putting that into a Rails engine, and then telling people, hey, you can just monkey patch everything because that's Rails, right? And people build really cool stuff on top of that. So we cannot say that it didn't work. It's just harder to maintain. And I'm going to show you an example of that because it's actually quite interesting. So example, for like in the usual e-commerce store, when you add, let's say, pair of shoes to a cart, right? Then you add the same pair of shoes to the cart again. It just usually just increases the quantity of the original item, right? So you have still one item in your cart, but with quantity equal to 2. And what's interesting is as you dive deeper into all of those crazy like B2B or build-to-order kind of products, sometimes 2 instances of the same product in cart can actually differ because they have some weird customizations, some like requests from the customer. Sometimes you have like, companies where you upload your photos that are then printed. So we've seen a lot of those use cases where companies needed to override this different behavior, and just every single time you add a product to a cart, it's like a new item in your cart. So the old way, and that's like Spree from, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, was that you just see the code of the controller inside Spree, right? So this is called populate, which adds an item to your cart. You can see that, well, we're getting the current cart from the session. Then we're looking for the particular variant, which is like a variation of a product. We take the quantity from params, and then we just add that to a cart. That's kind of an abstraction on top of the order contents, but this is like a fat model kind of approach. So you have order contents that have an add method. And you see it calls some private method called add to line item, which then, well, it looks if there's an existing line item for that product and then increases its quantity in that case. If not, it just creates a new one. So what people did, and we've seen some implementations like that, which made sense at that time, was that they just create a monkey patch inside their code base, and they just overrode a private method, which is well, yeah, I see a lot of people shaking their heads in disbelief, but well, it worked, right? Those companies were fairly successful, but from the maintenance standpoint, as you can imagine, it's a bit of a nightmare. Yeah, it is cool if you think about like short-term gains, longer term, not really. What was funny is that last year we also learned that we're effectively a maintainer of a gem called dface, which is this Railsy piece of technology that what it does, it allows you to overwrite, like inject specific HTML markup into the markup that Rails generated. So you have like controllers inside Spree. They render, for example, like, I don't know, menu of the admin panel. And then you have like your custom extension that I think in this case, it's like configuration for printing invoices or something like that. So you can just define that, insert bottom. So below an item with this specific data attribute, we should just inject some custom HTML. There was a lot of hacks like that used by extensions, developers. It worked, but it was a bit nasty. So in this case, you would just add like a new item on the left. Yeah, but good luck with upgrading that. Then you also, well, on the front end, right, you change the upstream version of Bootstrap that the core framework uses, and you end up with like a lot of buttons that look weird. Or sometimes somebody just removes a data attribute or an element with a particular ID in the upstream code base, and you may end up with like not seeing a button at all. So that happened, especially with upgrades. That was a lot of pain. For monkey patching, well, it's obvious, right? You make any kind of changes in the upstream code base, and then suddenly those monkey patches stop working. Well, that's a terrible approach overall, but I will tell a bit more about that, how that was solved. So one takeaway from here is I showed you like patching private methods, right? So if you don't give people the right interfaces to customize certain parts of your application, they will eventually start treating your private interfaces as, well, as the binding interface, right? So it makes refactoring harder if you want to keep compatibility for all users. Yeah, so they will pretty much override anything. And of course, that poses all sorts of challenges. What's cool is, and that's a pattern that I've seen a lot of discussions on like Ruby forums, on like Reddit, Twitter, etc., where a lot of people were claiming like, we don't need dependency injection, right? In Ruby, you can just do even like stop a constant in your tests, and it will just work just like dependency injection, which is not the case. So at some point, Spree's maintainer at that time, I think it was like 5 years ago, they started rewriting those core procedures and extracting that to like simple service objects. And that brought maintainability to a way better level, because instead of like writing over the internals, people were able to define their custom implementation. So that comes from, I think, upstream Spree, where you have the same procedure for adding to a card, but as you can see, that's encapsulated into a separate class that has this call method with a fairly well-defined interface. And the good thing is that any part of the core code base of Spree that performs this action, it uses a built-in dependency injection system to resolve that the implementation that the end developer wants to use. So if you would like to change that behavior, instead of doing those crazy monkey patches all over the place, you can just like create your own class, make it conform to the same interface, and then just update the reference in the dependency injection system. Besides, obviously, like clarity of code, right, and avoiding some mess in your code base, you can also test that in isolation. And this helped a lot in the overall like maintainability of projects. So this is something we've been pushing for a lot, and well, that helps, and people like it. What's also interesting is that technically, even when like doing those monkey patches, some of the people who were more conscious about the structure, object-oriented programming, etc., they would already try to introduce this kind of patterns in their monkey patches, right? So their monkey patches didn't contain code directly, but they were more like then calling their own service object just to perform the logic. But this helps a lot. With the UI, this is something that we're recently working on. So instead of telling people, yeah, you can just add those patches for the front end, and maybe they will be applied, maybe they will render where you want them to be. We also decided to decouple rendering the actual template, including custom actions that need to be shown, especially in the admin panel, where people just want to add some buttons to perform certain custom actions, maybe new menu sections. So instead of leaving it for developers to write their custom HTML code for those small customizations, we can just give them this simple interface and even a set of helper classes that help them, for example, execute specific permissions, etc. And we can just let them modify that by code in, for example, their initializers. So this makes sure that the UI is consistent and we have more control over how it's defined. So that's also something that we're looking at in terms of increasing maintainability of the tool. And then there's working in Ruby, and I know that's that is a topic that didn't have that much adoption, I think. But we rely on duck typing, right? So everything that quacks like a duck is a duck. But the question, especially if we're giving a lot of those behaviors inside a library, is how should that duck quack so that it fits into the place. And yeah, this is a common problem. It's not only Spring, it's also in Rails and in a lot of libraries where you have those parameters that can be pretty much anything, right? So even when adding to cart, we have this hash called options, and it can be anything. And what's funny is that when you look at implementations, customizations, people calling this service object on their own, people sometimes put things there that don't really fit there, just because, I don't know, well, they thought it would work, and there's nothing to prevent them from doing that. We can, of course, use docs, and there are some standards in how to describe those, so that when you generate a documentation, it will at least tell you what kind of options you can put. It's also cool if you use RubyMine, because it will show you those hints when you're typing your code. But still, it's just advisory. And one of the issues we had with actually doing upgrades of existing Spring installations was that even interface changes, those advisories won't help you much, right? You would need to review the documentation of every single method call just to understand that somebody shifted parameters or deprecated some options. And I know that using any sort of stronger typing is a bit of controversial topic right now, but observing and also working with some, for example, JavaScript projects, I think the attitude that they have and the overall approach to typing is pretty cool, because you can think of typing not as something that we enforce on everybody who wants to use our project, but we can add those types just to support developers using our library. So they, first of all, they can automatically verify their code if they want. If not, well, that's fine, right? But at the same time, it also gives more powerful IDE support for interacting with code. So that's something that I think is very well done by the TypeScript community, where they just give those types. And I think it became a standard that if you publish a TypeScript library, you give type definitions, and then, well, if somebody wants to use them, that's cool. If not, that's also cool. But it's there to support everybody. Yeah, you can write automated checks. Your IDE just behaves better. So we've been playing around with those two tools that we have right now. We have Sorbet that I think Stripe created, right? And there's also RBS. And once again, we have this dualism with two approaches, people being a bit opinionated on certain implementation details. In my experience, Sorbet's a bit more mature, whereas RBS claims to, well, it's closer to Ruby, right? So it's a hard choice. Good thing is that we can technically convert one to the other with some effort. This is like RBS docs, and I think that will be blocking adoption for quite a while because it's very hard to find good examples. For example, how to define an interface in RBS. So you have to go to those like abstract syntax trees and get an understanding of how those works, which is good for like experienced developers. But if somebody starts with Ruby, doesn't have the full understanding of how this notation works, maybe a bit of like blocker for adoption. On the other hand, Sorbet has pretty good docs with a lot of examples. They also have like an interactive playground that you can open in your browser, and even without setting that up for your project, you can at least get a grasp of how this works. So this is pretty cool. And with our example, we've been experimenting with Sorbet. This hasn't been merged yet, and there's more work to be done, but I wanted to share some experiences from adopting that inside an open source project. So what's cool is if we have dependency injection, we can define interfaces. And with Sorbet, from what we've experimented with, like defining modules that claim to be interfaces, works pretty well. You can type all the parameters a method is supposed to call, and then the implementation, of course, if the developer wants, right, because they can still use the good old duck typing, they can just extend your interface. They can mark their file as typed, and then they have to like repeat the signature, this time saying that they override that signature, and then they can just provide their own implementation of this logic. And it's pretty cool because if, for example, the override that they put doesn't match what's in the interface, they will get a warning. Same if the interface doesn't match the method that they provide, which especially with those like keyword arguments or hashes all over the place, it is quite useful. And on top of that, if you use like RubyMine or VS Code, even the IDE will highlight specific places in your typed code where it will see that you're calling a method incorrectly, right? So you get this faster feedback loop. It's not that, for the ongoing development, it's good, but where we see it's like super helpful is, for example, when you're upgrading your stack. So you're going to a newer version of Spree. You have some of those custom, for example, service objects implemented, and without doing a full like QA of your installation, you would like to get some feedback whether the interfaces didn't break out of the sudden. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, they are optional. They can increase productivity, at least in the longer term. Of course, it comes with some trade-offs. First of all, and that's especially if you rely on some like monkey patching, meta programming, etc. It can be a bit of a challenge to introduce types to the existing code. So you may need to change some structures a little bit. The other thing is that it's just not that popular. So even if you look for some resources online on how to define certain structures in, for example, Sorbet, even though it's well documented, you may still struggle just to find some good guidance. And then not all developers will also understand how to verify their code against your types. So this is still a bit of a blurry area. It also requires more structure, and there are sometimes you run into a situation where you, for example, cannot properly type an argument that's just like this open-ended options hash where you know what kind of values will be there. What's cool is that it pushes you to also think about like using structs inside of those hashes all over the place. So this can be good, but it is an effort. And it's also like maintenance effort. So summing up, first of all, from our experiences, as the open source project grows, the dynamic changes a lot, and you need to adapt on multiple fronts just to support that. Sometimes moving slower is actually good. Like, we don't need to be on top of all the trends, but it's good that the users are happy, that the community is happy, and that everybody can stay productive without rewriting the whole code base over and over again. And the last thing is that sometimes if you look outside of what we see in the Ruby community, maybe lurk into TypeScript with all of their problems, or into Java, .NET, that can also bring some interesting lessons that will help us build better code, better projects. So that's also something I think we should do a bit more, instead of sticking to those well-known patterns. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Hey, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I was wondering, how do you collect the information about how people are monkey patching Spree? How to decide what to refactor into dependency injection pattern, for example?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We do support a lot of existing users, especially once they hit a point where they've grown with Spree, where they just contact us for some support with, I don't know, upgrades or refactoring their code. So that gives us a lot of data points around what kind of crazy things people do over the years. We also get involved with the community, although I think we should do more of that, where people also bring that up, right? Especially once they became more aware that, this monkey patching doesn't scale. Sometimes you just hear people saying that, yeah, it would be good if we could replace this behavior without having to, I don't know, replace the whole structure of instantiation of dependencies or something like that. But it's mostly one-on-one conversations and, working with the tool on your own.
I actually have a question. Because with the extension from the people that people were first doing with monkey patching, and then you provided them with some more elegant solutions to this problem, it seems like you are kind of going in the direction of events, and probably you are considering events. I'm wondering, what was your conclusion in your internal discussions about it?
Yeah, I think that could be too much of a breaking change for now. So we're sticking to, those smaller steps we can make in order to support existing users without breaking too much. With events, you're introducing more loose coupling, right? So I think that may be a bit of a problem, but this is an interesting concept overall. I think there were some attempts with the fork of Spree, with Solidus, where people adding emitting events upon certain actions, but still the core isn't event driven, right? So those events are mostly to notify, I don't know, custom handlers that you may build next to the core logic.
Okay, thanks. In the add item example, actually during your talk, I had maybe just wrong enlightenment moment. Maybe when you implement cards, which is very typical for tutorials, and even I'm also working on some very simple e-commerce project. Maybe instead of card.add item, we should have two methods: add item, which means add new item, and increase existing item as a separate method, because it seems like this is a common issue in all e-commerce platforms.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of how far you expose that interface, because I think in some, I don't know if that's in the upstream code or not. I haven't touched the add item thing in a while. But I think internally it actually has those two paths. So technically within the add item service object or whatever you call that, you have two branches that are separate private methods. One adds to an existing item, the other doesn't. But on the interface level, there's just one add item, right? Maybe it will make sense to add two. What I'm thinking about, it's not this specific case, but a similar. We have this thing that, imagine you create a card as a guest user, so it's identified by some ID or token that people can interact with it through the API. Then somebody signs in, for example, during the checkout. So we need to attach that card to that existing user. And the current behavior is that you have an API endpoint for that. You have an internal default service object implementation that will just assign that card to your user. Now, there is a case where somebody was, for example, logged in on a different computer and already had a card created there. So there are two options, right? Right now, we just discard this old card, not care about it, and this new takes precedence. But when we were talking to community and even some of our clients, they said it for them, because of various business decisions, it makes more sense to just merge those two cards. So the content of the guest card just gets added to your signed-in card, and then of course you continue with just one card. And what we're now looking at is just to provide, for example, two implementations and say that if those match your desired behavior, you can just configure Spree to use either this associate and just take the new card, or merge card. That's up to you, right? As a matter of configuration. And probably we could just have two strategies of adding an item, also provided as the core of the framework, and then just tell users, you can pick whichever makes most sense for you. Or if you don't rely on our standard endpoints for adding to a card, you can just call that other service object directly, whatever makes more sense for you.
Okay, thanks.
But yeah, there's a lot of decisions like that. And there's always the default behavior, and then there's this second most popular behavior that at some point maybe makes sense to introduce to the core.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.